I've spent the majority of my life working in the outdoors as a soldier, outdoorsman, and guide. Many years ago, I came to a crossroad in my military career. I felt like I was at the point where I was no longer able to learn about survival from the military. So I searched and I watched as many new shows popped up like Dual Survival, Survivor Man, and others. Shows that partnered seasoned soldiers with primitive living instructors. I watched experienced soldiers who had amazing skills with tools fall short without them, and I had to look deep within myself and ask why. So, realizing that something was missing in my training, I then formulated a plan. I set out to find people with these skills in my area, to find out who they were, where they come from, who taught them, and more importantly, how could I learn and master these skills for myself. This journey has led me to a place where I have had the privilege of teaching these things that I love to others. Skills that now range from advanced navigation to primitive fire. This is my journey to primitive. This is my story, yet it is a story that has never really been about me. Another friend that I've developed along my journey to primitive is Dave Wescott. This is Dave Wescott's story.
Okay, I'm Dave Wescott. I've been teaching primitive skills since about 1970s when I started with Larry Olson, and have just made a living out of it since I started doing it. So it's been my bread and butter for a long, long time. Taught for a number of different universities and taught skills there that range from primitive skills to the most modern skills, but the primitive skills have always been my fallback area of expertise. And then right now, of course, my passion is classic camping, so I've moved up a little bit in the evolutionary ladder just because I'm getting older and I like it nice and soft and comfortable now. But the primitive skills have always been my first love.
What is classic camping?
Classic camping are the skills that we would have done around the turn of the century when people were, well, they said in the period from about 1890 to 1930, there was more people camping per capita than any other time before or since. Everybody was camping. It was the thing to do. And so there was a huge amount of equipment, of skills, of writing being done, of people being out on the land during that period of time. And it was popular up until about the 1950s, and then in the 1950s and 60s, because so many people were still camping, that were creating impacts, and that's when we came up with this idea of minimum impact and lightweight gear and backpacking. And so backpacking essentially knocked camping off of the top spot. And so people started doing backpacking instead of camping, and so we've lost a lot of those skills that were part of camping, and some of them needed to be because of the impacts they created. But for the most part, those skills are still viable alternative to modern camping, and the comfort that you can have in a classic style is much. I mean, you can take anybody who's a modern backpacker and put them in touch with what we're doing here, and they just go, "How come we don't camp this way?" So, well, primitive skills are. There's an argument amongst the academics as to whether the word primitive is appropriate or not. For a long time in their literature, primitive meant something that was crude and it was a pejorative. It was something that wasn't a compliment to somebody to say they were primitive, and so they'll put it down and say that we shouldn't use it. Our take on the subject is the fact that has nothing to do with crudeness, has nothing to do with marginalizing people. It has to do with the idea that primitive skills are first skills, and these first skills are the ones that are the thing that are common to all human beings, regardless of their ethnic backgrounds or cultures. Everybody had a relative at some point in time that came out of the Stone Age, and so these first skills, I think, are the thing that bring us together as opposed to the things that divide us up. Right now we have this whole push on diversity, and yes, diversity is important for evolution, but when it starts to divide our society, then I think it's gone a little bit too far. So we need to look at things that bring us together and create this commonality between us, and that is Stone Age culture. It's really interesting to watch how people come into the field of primitive skills, because people will discover what we're doing at Rabbit Stick, and feel like they're the only ones that have been doing it. It's just like I've been doing this in my backyard, and my relatives all think that I'm crazy. I've got stinky hides and sticks all over my backyard, and everybody thinks I'm nuts. And when I discovered you guys, it was like I found a family. I thought I was the only one weirdo out there, and all of a sudden they find that there's a whole lot of weirdos out there. And so the topic and the ability to access the information is becoming more broad-based than it ever has. A lot of it because of TV right now. But survival, to me, has been co-opted. Survival and primitive skills to me used to be synonymous. That's how I came into the field. Was the survival skills I learned were primitive outdoor living skills that came from Larry Olson's outdoor survival book. And so I've always connected in that way. Now survival is so heavily gear-oriented and stuff-oriented and gadget-oriented that it's kind of gone in a different direction. And so you see all these survival experts on TV right now, who once they lose their ferro rod, their basket case, they have no backups at all because they have no gear anymore. And so people, I think, are realizing that these basic skills are more important than the stuff. And so I think we're seeing this resurgence of interest in people coming back and saying, I want to learn those things. Yeah, the stuff is nice and it's a luxury and it makes me that much more comfortable. But if I know the other stuff, then mentally I can be a lot more comfortable because I can relax. And I can always know I can solve my problems by being able to improvise the stuff I need from the resources that are around me. So for people to find and access this information, it's probably more available than it's ever been. I mean, when I started in the 70s, it was very limited. And then when we started Rabbit Stick in 1988, our goal was to bring together those instructors that were teaching across the country to share information and talk with one another. And that was the first effort that was ever done that, because up until then, it was kind of like everybody was very protective of their own their niche, and they didn't want anybody else to steal their stuff. And we kind of changed that tide to where now stuff is widely shared. The only thing I don't like about that is that the sharing has gotten to the point now to where people are sharing, but they're kind of claiming that it's their original idea, and all of a sudden we have instant experts online that aren't citing their sources, and I balk at that. I think that if you get information that comes from someplace, every technology has an evolution, it has a genealogy, and you need to cite where you get that information from, as opposed to just all of a sudden, I just got this out of the air type of stuff. I taught myself. I hear that all the time. So, there's access to it. It's available everywhere. There's over 30 of these primitive skills gatherings now that have adapted what we've started here, and they're available all over the country at all different times of year. So you could pretty much go on a circuit of following the primitive skills trail and just go from gathering to gathering if you wanted to. Larry Olson, to me, is the nexus of where a lot of this interest in primitive skills came from. He's the guy that made it accessible. In other words, the information was there, but it was there in ethnographic reports and those sorts of things, and so it was very, very tough for the average person to access the information that was needed in order to say, okay, I want to learn how to do stoneworking, I want to learn how to build fires from scratch, I want to learn how to make traps and snares, I want to learn all these skills that have an application to where I live. And Larry was the one that took him out of the ethnographic record and said, here is how you do these skills, and made it accessible to people. So when outdoor survival skills came out in the late 1960s, it became an instant hit because, well, the timing was really good too, because you had a huge movement in the counterculture. Holder's catalog was out, and so his books spread rapidly amongst people who were looking for alternative lifestyles at the same time as people were looking for different kinds. Well, it became an avocational pursuit for a lot of people, and a lifestyle for some people. And so, to me, that started it all. And if you go back and you look at the histories of who's adopted these kinds of technologies as a teaching paradigm, Larry is connected to pretty much everybody. You can't deny that. There are pockets that have evolved on their own and come in touch with Larry and then gone off on their own again, and don't necessarily recognize him as a source. But to me, without him having done what he did, those who have developed their own programs independently, I don't think the momentum would have been there for the people to be attracted to them. Does that make sense? So I think he influenced a whole lot of what was going on. And then if you look at the early rabbit sticks back in the 70s, there was people, our history of what's going on here gets skewed because of the fact that most interviewing that's going on right now is going on in the West. And so there's a Western connection, there's a hub out here of people who have worked together for a long time. Whereas if you look to the East, I mean, there's a whole Tom Brown thing out there that with thousands of people coming through that school and hundreds of schools popping up from that school that a lot of times don't get recognized in the history, and I think they should. But they don't get recognized as much, I think, because of the fact that a lot of the action that's going on right now is going on in the West. And so, but if you once again, if you look in the East, what's going on, there's a huge impetus of information that's out there too. So, I met Larry Olson. I was way into Native American traditions in my teens and all the way up into college. And I mean, I was 35 years old before I finally figured out I was never going to be an Indian. And so I was in college, and I had seen his book. I had two things came about. I'd seen his book, and my friend of my parents gave me a copy of Ishi, which hit me about the same time. And if you look at the two books, Larry's photos are almost a white man reproduction of Ishi photos a lot of the times. And so once again, he made it accessible for white people to connect to that idea. And so I had those two books and was going to college and realized that I was at the same school that Larry Olson was teaching at. And we ran into each other just by happenstance in a hallway one day and got to talking, and he sent me down to his office, and I spent 3 hours in his office and convinced me that that's what I was going to do for the rest of my life, and that's what I've been doing for the rest of my life, much to the chagrin of my wife. You know, we'd been married 2 months, I think, when I met Larry. Then I was out on a 30-day course after we'd been married for 2 months. So, and it hasn't stopped. So, fortunately, she's a very patient woman, and she's gotten used to it. So,
Yeah.
so that's.
It took a lot more people than myself to make this all happen. I didn't invent all the skills. I didn't master all the skills. Dave Holliday could walk circles around me with respect to the skills. But they took their cue from me in the beginning. And I don't know how they would have done that, or it probably would have come along some way, but somehow everybody glommed onto me and I become the world expert on it. That's the way the TV looked at it anyway. But I never felt that way. I knew that there were people that were just as good or better, and I gathered them about me as best I could, and they helped me through a lot of things, and they counseled me in many ways in working with youth, and they taught me the skills that they were learning over and above what I could do, and it was just a wonderful existence. I had some of the greatest friends in the world. Zeke Sanchez came in early. We had a program called Youth Leadership 480, which was helping troubled youth to get back into school at BYU. They had a policy that if you flunked out, you had to wait 2 years before you could reapply, or you need to go on a mission and come back and apply, or go in the military for 2 years and then come back and apply. They wanted to shorten that 2-year time period, so they asked me to take them out for half a semester and put them through this experience that I'd been working with. And if that got them back in, and then they would re-enroll them into BYU immediately the next semester, see how they did. That was widely accepted and very successful, and would be to this day, except I don't think they're doing it there now since I left. Then as other people came through the program, and I'd find one or two in almost every group that I could hire, and then train them, and they could do just as good as anyone else. There's a list of several hundred, which I couldn't even begin to quote here. Some of the notables that have gone ahead and done things with Dave Wescott, for one, who took over the Rabbit Stick Rendezvous from me after I didn't have time to run it anymore. And he's turned it into an international annual event that is very successful. They had over 600 and some students there this past year. And then he started the winter count, so that we'd have an additional one for the winter time. It's been wildly successful.
So that's how I met him, and then I I was like a sponge. I mean, I was probably obnoxious to the point to where I just sucked everything I could get out of him and everybody else that was affiliated with the programs, to where I advanced pretty rapidly in the skill set. And so I started being his TA and teaching his classes. And then when he was injured in a car wreck, it was probably about '73, I think. He was out of commission, and his classes were still going on. And so I stepped in, and so I was the teacher for the courses that he had been teaching. So I learned a lot really fast. And then he was phasing out of the field programs, and so I was working with Doug Nelson, running the 30-day survival programs. Well, I was running the youth programs. Doug was running the university programs, and then I phased out of the youth programs and then went to work with Doug in the longer programs. And so for 4 years, I was pretty much in the field nonstop. I mean, constantly using these skills and living these skills. So it became part of me. And Larry was the guy that got me started. Yeah, BOSS, better known as Boulder Outdoor Survival School, came out of the idea that the programs that we ran were at BYU. That's where Larry was teaching. And BYU decided they didn't want to run those programs anymore. And so Doug Nelson, who was running them at the time, he and I were students together. Matter of fact, we did our first student course together in 1971. I did my first course, and we did that together. And so he was teaching on campus when they decided not to run those programs, and so he asked them if he could start doing them commercially. Well, that's what he did. He incorporated it and started. I think it was 1977 was when he incorporated the company, and ran it as a commercial venture. And then in probably about 84, I came in and started working with him in the summers and helping him out with the programs. And then in probably 83, I started working. In 84, 85, I bought him out. He'd been doing it long enough to where he was ready to move on, and I wanted to do something. I'd left my college position, and so I was looking for something to do as a venture, a personal venture. And so I took it over and ran it from 85 to 97, and so it developed that way. And it was a tough transition because it came out of a university setting, and even though Doug was running it commercially, the majority of his students were still coming from the university. That was his feeder source. But when I came on, all of a sudden that was gone, and so we basically had a name and an old Chevy truck and had to start from scratch. I mean, we rebuilt it from the ground up. And one of the reasons that I think we had a lot of notoriety then, and I think our credibility was because of the fact that we were able to attract very good people to make the program run. I mean, we had a dozen or so very dedicated staff that were highly talented that made our programs really working. Without them, we never would have succeeded. And one of the things that I valued was this idea that it would be very easy for a company as small as ours and as tight-knit as ours to become very inbred. And so I required the staff to actually go out and take courses from other people and learn new skills and bring those back. And if they wanted to advance in the company, that's how they could do it, was to advance their own expertise. And so that's one reason we started Rapid Stick, was rather than sending my staff out all over the country, we would bring the instructors together, which would benefit them and would benefit my staff having access to them at the same time. Matt Graham, same thing. I think just showed up in Boulder, and I'm not sure if he was scheduled to take a course or if he just showed up in Boulder, and I think he just showed up in Boulder.
When I was in my early 20s, I'd been doing the primitive skills for about 5-6 years, and I saw in the back of this magazine there was an ad it said Boulder Outdoor Survival School, had this arrow going through it. And I was like, wow, there's actually people doing this stuff. It said primitive Stone Age technologies. So I was like, I called up the number, and this gentleman, Dave Wescott, answers the phone. And right off the bat, I'm just like, I didn't even introduce myself. I was just like, can I work for you? Like just a total stalker dweeb, And he's like, tell me a little bit about yourself. So we started chatting for a while, and he's like, you gotta take a course first. And at the time, I was literally just a wandering hunter-gatherer. I had no money. And I told him that. I was like, I really just don't have the funds to afford a course right now. And this was quite some time ago, and he's like, well, He's like, come on over, we'll see what we can do. So I got this bike from a thrift store, loaded up, tied up the blanket to the front, bivy sack to the back, and pedaled over from California. And when I got to the Utah lands, I fell in love with the landscape. And then I met Dave Wescott. We had a great connection right away. And I ended up working there that summer. I was involved with 8 courses. And it's, pretty much been teaching in this landscape ever since.
And hung around long enough to where finally kind of got absorbed into the program. I think we required him, if I'm not mistaken, we require all of our staff to take a course first, and that's not to make money off them as much as it is that you can't teach those courses unless you've been through those experiences yourself. So to give him field experience to know what the courses are all about, he ended up taking a course with us. And then worked a few courses. I remember he was on one of our tougher courses. It was a 14-day course that we ran that was really, really, they used to call it the rock biter. Well, what was it? It was a hunter-gatherer courses, I think. And so he and Brett Crystal and my son Braun, would run those courses. They were tough courses, and so we had some very healthy people running those things, and Matt was one of them. So.
And I saw a truck go by, and I recognized the truck because it was Boulder Outdoor Survival School's old Chevy. And Dave Wescott was driving it, and he said hi, and he said he heard that I could do a hand drill fire, and nobody was doing them in those days. And I guess he got a call from Larry Dean Olson that there was a kid someplace in southern Utah that could do a hand drill fire. And I was him, and Wescott and I saw each other, and we'd heard each other's names a lot because he was in the BYU programs and had been running them for a while with Doug Nelson and running courses. Right about the same time I came in, he was moving on.
David and I have been moving in parallel paths for a long time. David Holliday and I have been married. There's a Freudian slip.
Okay, I'll cut it.
Yeah. David Holliday and I have been moving in parallel paths for years. We had been moving in parallel paths for years. And so when I left the survival programs, I went to work for Outward Bound for a couple of years. And he came into the programs after I had left. And so I kept hearing, do you know David Holliday? Well, it's like this, everybody says, do you know David Holliday? Well, yeah, of course, that's everybody's claim to fame is knowing David Holliday. So everybody's favorite primitive skills person. So so I had heard about him, and everybody says you need to meet him. You guys are the same, and yada yada yada. And so it wasn't until I came back and took over Boss about 1980. Well, I took it over in '85, and so I think I met him in the summer of '80s, probably '87. I think was when we finally ran into each other, and it was just instant connection. There was no doubt about it. And so he was teaching at Tucson Public Schools and coming up to live on his property at Boulder during the summers with his son, and so that's why we had never met, was because his travels back and forth and my travels to Boulder that just didn't ever jive until that particular time. And so we finally met, and it was like we had this long conversation about who really knew what to do, who walked the walk and who talked the talk, and who, the difference between the two. And so we were having this big long conversation about who could do skills and just could talk about them and not do them. And so then we got into this discussion about hand drills, and Dave said, I could do a hand drill. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. So he started doing a hand drill, and well, it's like doing it on TV. If somebody's filming you, it's never going to work. You're always going to run out of breath, or things aren't going to work quite right. And so you're always fumbling around whenever you do. You can do it 100 times by yourself, and then when you have to really put on a show, that's when it doesn't work. And so it wasn't working. And I didn't know as much about David at the time, but he's probably the most bullheaded, stubborn person I've ever known in my entire life. If he says he's going to do it, he'll do it, which makes him very dependable that way. So anyway, so he was doing a hand drill. My wife was there, and he finally had done it long enough to where he developed blisters on the palms of his hands about the size of silver dollars.
And we've been talking a lot about ingenuous people who talk a lot about what they know, but they really can't do anything. And I didn't know who he was referring to, but I said, yeah, me too, I hate hypocrisy also. And so then after a long, introduction to his wife and me, I and him, and we talk about how we've never met each other much, but we've heard of each other a lot. I was living with hardly any clothes on. I had a son who was 4. I'd been making hand drill fires all summer long. My fireboard was nothing but holes, and my muscles were strong, and I was ready to show off. And so I proceeded to fail at making a hand drill fire on a clear day for about 20 or 30 tries. And I don't know how much time it took because I was so focused, but it began to look different. It looked like it was getting darker. And finally, Paula, Dave's wife, Paula Wescott, says, we believe you can do a fire. We can tell by looking at your hand drill set that you've made a lot of fires, but we've got to go. And they both kind of looked at me with pity and took off.
And I think one of them popped in the process and got on my wife, and we finally just said, "That's nice, David. I believe you. You can stop now." And no, I can do it. And so we finally gave up and went back to town, which was probably about 7 miles from his house.
And my son and I were so used to going to bed when the sun goes down. This was probably 9 o'clock at night in the summertime, right? So it's still light a little bit. But I was so exhausted, and I had such huge blisters on both hands that I looked at that hand drill, and I looked at that hearth, that fireboard, and I said, I wonder why this didn't work. And I was so discouraged that I threw it about 15 feet, and I remember it landing and hitting in the middle of a sumac bush and then dropping into the sand. And I remember laying down and sleeping next to the fire. We already had a fire going because I think Juan was already cooking himself some food, my 4-year-old. Well, I fall asleep, and unlike my normal night, I do not wake up again. And when I wake up in the morning, my face is in the sand. I'm breathing in sand, and I'm right where I laid down. And the first thing I see 15 feet away is that hand drill set and that hearth, and I'm thinking to myself, I wonder why that didn't work. So I just walked over there and grabbed it, and I had great big blisters, but I powered down on that thing, popped my blisters as I was going, and I made a spark on the first time down. And I thought, I wonder why that didn't happen while they were watching. So then I wake my son up, make an Apache match or a fire match, a fire bundle, fire carrying match, about this long, put my son on my shoulders, and I walk up over that mesa right there. And I get up on the flats and I walk across another taller mesa. So I get up on the flats and go up on the higher mesa, drop in, and I save about 3 miles to get to Boulder. It's 7 miles on the road, or 7.5 from here, but it's about 3 miles and something through there. And I walk to Dave Wescott's trailer, and by then it's 7 in the morning. So I must have got up pretty early. And I knock on his door, and then I blow on my Apache match. I called him Apache match. I'm the one that started that. I don't know if that's accurate to anybody else's history, but I just like the way that sounds, and I like the way the Apaches make them, or made them. And I blow on that thing, and it comes on to flame right there on his porch at the Boss trailer when it used to be by the museum in Boulder, Utah. And he's in his boxer shorts. He looks at the flame, and he goes, oh, I'll be right there. And he goes and gets his clothes on, comes back out, and he says, show us how you do the fire.
Next morning, I got a knock on the door. Here's David Holliday standing on my doorstep with a tinder bundle going, see, I can do it. We had done it after we left and walked to town the next morning to show me that he could actually do a hand drill fire, which in today's parlance is no big deal because hand drill fires are pervasive. Everybody's doing them. It's like no big thing. Well, in 1988, when we did our first rabbit stick, the only person doing hand drills in the country that I knew of was Jim Riggs. And so when we did the first rabbit stick, there was 48 instructors and 2 students. While we sat around, all we did was we would we would focus on a topic, then when we get tired of that, we can move to the next one. Well, Jim Riggs was the man on hand drill fires.
So we go over to the museum, to the replica of some rooms that they'd made back in the 70s, and we sit down in front of there, and my blisters are healed again, or at least sealed to the full of water, and I go down that spindle first try, and it pops that blister and squirts that white blood cell liquid all over the place. I think it even squirts a couple people around me. They claim they don't remember that. I remember it being very uncomfortable. And I go down the spindle just a few times and I got a spark. And I said, that's how you do it. And so years later, I was working for Boss, and he was introducing me to a class, and he said, Dave Holliday, you're going to be your instructor. You're going to like him. It's your 28-day trip, and you're going to like this guy. And it's the first time I actually heard him say something positive about me, because he didn't say negative or positive. He just didn't talk much. So I was like, wow, he likes me. And then he said, and what impresses me most isn't that he can do hand drill fires, it's the fact that he'd walk a long ways to keep his word. And that was the first big compliment he ever made to me, and that was the beginning of a great working relationship.
And unfortunately, Jim passed away just a couple weeks ago, but he was the one that kind of got everybody started on that thing. Well, then it just spread like wildfire to where now it's just a common thing. And that has to do with a lot of these skills. I mean, a lot of these skills, we struggled with them for years, trying to figure out how to do them. But now there are people who are learning them in a matter of weeks, who are heads and shoulders above what my skill level is, just because there are people who have developed those skills to the point to where they're standing on their shoulders now and saying, okay, the level of skill that they have now, they can access much faster than we ever could, just because, not because of necessarily the information, but because of the level of instruction that's available now. So David was one of those guys, and so he was doing stuff that I had never seen before, and so we brought him in to be one of our lead instructors at Boss when I owned Boss, and it's just been kind of one of those things ever since. We've traveled all over together, we've done programs together, we've worked on different projects together, and we've just been very good friends ever since.
And I became senior skills instructor and senior instructor for Outdoor Survival Skill School, Boulder Outdoor Survival Skill School, for about the next 18 years. So that was the beginning of a really good working relationship with, I think, one of the best men I've ever met. Regardless of what anybody else in the whole wide world might know about him or think about him, my relationship with him is wonderful. And I think most people that know him agree that he's a man of integrity and that he's a really good craftsman, really good at anything he decides to do, and very honest. And that's what I like about him.